In the harsh silence of the snowy frontier, a voiceless young woman is cast aside by those meant to protect her. Mocked by women and sold by her own kin, she crosses paths with a reclusive man known only as Clayton, bound by secrets and shadowed pasts. Their fragile connection holds a tension neither of them dares name yet. When the snow stopped falling that morning, the silence left behind was not kind. It wrapped around the empty streets like a burial cloth. Nothing stirred, not the wind, not the shutters, not even the hearts of the people who came to stand in the middle of Dustmore Crossing, bundled in their wool and suspicion, their breath rising like ghosts. They had gathered for the auction, private one, but everyone came. That was the way of cruel things. They drew crowds, more than kind ones ever did. She stood on the wooden block, her hands tied gently in front of her, a gray wool shawl hanging off her shoulders like a broken wing. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't move. A pale blue sack was tied over her head. Her stepbrothers claimed it was for her own dignity, but everyone knew better. The real reason was simple. They didn't want anyone to hear the way her silence made them uncomfortable. She couldn't speak. She hadn't spoken a word since she was 7 years old. And when the sack was lifted, some of the women laughed, not the kind laughter you hear on porches or after supper, but the dry laughter that hurts more than a slap. They whispered among themselves, "Look at her face like a ghost. Look at those eyes. She's probably cursed." Her name was Clara. She didn't flinch. One of her stepbrothers nudged her with his elbow, forcing her to step forward, and called out prices like she was a mule with a cracked hoof. They had sold her mother's rings, her books, even the old harmonica she used to keep under her pillow. But this was the final piece. And no one batted an eye. That's when he stepped forward. Clayton didn't say a word either. He was known for silence as much as he was. For the scar that split his left eyebrow like lightning. He had lived at the very edge of the North Ridge, where the snow never fully melted, in a wooden house built by his grandfather's hands. Folks called it a peak, but it was more a fortress, lonely, white, and far. Some said he'd once had a family. Some said he was a killer. Some said nothing at all. He gave the gold quietly. No bidding war. No raised voice. He untied Clara's wrists himself, handed her the shawl that had slipped off her shoulders, and led her down the steps with a hand resting just behind her back, not touching, only there. She didn't resist. Didn't look back. Not at the women's laughter. Not at the stepbrothers who shrugged and pocketed coins. No one saw her again after that. Not in the town. Not in the market. Not by the river where girls washed clothes and whispered secrets. They said she'd vanished into the ice with Clayton. And that was that. A few speculated he'd taken her for strange reasons. Others believed she wouldn't last a week up there on that snowy ridge. A mute woman with no fire in her eyes. She'd freeze or flee, but the truth was gentler than any of them could imagine. At the peak, there was a porch with one broken chair and a kettle that always steamed by the fire. Gave her a room, not the guest room, but his sister's old room, with the quilt made of scraps from a childhood that hadn't seen snow in years. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell stories. He didn't expect her to cook or speak or smile, but he left notes, little ones, folded and placed on her windowsill each morning. Sometimes only a single word, fresh, safe, stay, and sometimes full sentences, clumsy and childlike in their attempt to be kind. He brought her books with large letters and few words. He showed her how to feed the hens, taught her how to light the wood stove when her hands trembled. He built a sled with her name carved underneath, though she didn't know that until weeks later, when she fell off it, laughing silently into the snow, her breath bursting like prayer. He never asked why she didn't speak, and she never asked why he limped at dawn when he thought no one watched. They lived like that, quiet and distant, but never apart. The days turned whiter, the skies darker, the snow thick as stories that never get told. Some evenings, he'd sit on the porch, carving figures out of pine, a woman holding a bird, a child curled into sleep, a man kneeling before a cross. He never reached Clara, watched from the window, sometimes pressing her fingers to the glass, as though tracing his silhouette into the frost. Then came the storm. It hit just after New Year's wine that screamed like 1,000. Used. The trees bent, the roof creaked. For 3 days they stayed inside, eating from the pantry, sleeping by turns so the fire never died. On the 4th day, Clayton didn't wake. His fever had begun the night before, quiet as all his suffering. He had gone out at dusk to fetch firewood, and when he returned, his hands were red and shaking, his face pale like hers had once been. He smiled and said nothing, only gestured that he was fine, but he wasn't. Clara didn't know medicine. She didn't know what root to boil or what prayer to whisper. But she stayed. She pressed cool cloths to his brow. She fed him spoonfuls of broth with trembling hands. She wrapped his arms in thick towels and prayed not with words, but with touch, with presence, with eyes that never closed. On the 7th day, he opened his eyes and reached for her hand, and he whispered, "I'm sorry." She shook her head and tried to smile, though her lips were cracked and her body weak. Her silence had never spoken louder. When spring came, the snow melted from the ridge like sorrow retreating. The path to town reappeared. But she didn't walk it not once. Clayton carved a new sign for the mailbox. Clayton and Clara, people in town stopped talking, 'cause rumors can't outlive kindness, and the women who once laughed. They said nothing when they saw the quiet lady in the blue shawl ride by in a wagon with her hands wrapped gently around the reins. She still didn't speak, but they say her eyes had more language than most men's mouths. They say she left flowers on the steps of the old church every month. They say she forgave her stepbrothers without ever visiting them again. And when someone once asked her years later, in a new town, in a new dress, with snow in her hair and laughter around her why, she never said a word. She handed them a carving of a man kneeling beside a fire and a woman watching from the frost. On the bottom was a note carved by hand, "He heard me anyway." The thaw came slowly that year, as though the land itself had forgotten how to be warm. Trees stood bare longer than usual, and the streams murmured with hesitation, like a song half remembered. But inside the ridge house, change had already begun, quiet and steady, like a second chance wearing snow on its shoulders. Clayton still rose early, though his body moved with more care now. He walked with a cane he made himself from a birch limb he found during the storm. Clara had watched him carve it by the fire, its stroke deliberate, silent, respectful. She never asked about his limp, and he never explained. Some things were too heavy for words, and others were better carried alone. But the days were soft between them. She wrote more now small messages on scraps of cloth. Chalk on slate, sometimes just a nod or a touch on his arm that spoke volumes. Clayton, in turn, began telling her stories not loud or boastful, but low and hesitant, as if unsure his voice was still allowed to be heard. He told her about the sister who once sang lullabies through the attic floor, about the mother who died. One winter just like this, her breath turning to frost before her hands let go of the sewing needle, about the baby he'd once held for 2 hours. Years ago, while the mother screamed in the barn and bled into the straw, his wife, Clara, didn't flinch when he said that word. His wife had been gone 8 years. She died giving birth to a child that hadn't lived more than a moment. And when the grave was filled, and the barn cleaned, and the dishes dried, the silence that came after had been louder than a war. But it wasn't that death that broke him, it was the people who stopped coming. Neighbors who once drank from his cups and rode beside him at cattle fairs now crossed the street. They whispered that maybe the land was cursed, that maybe he'd done something wrong. It wasn't said out loud, not really. But shame rarely needs words to be understood. I started carving to keep my hands from trembling. He once told her, eyes fixed on the fire, "You ever notice that? Shame lives in your hands," she had. That spring, the mountain bloomed late, but bloom it did. Wildflowers in violet and bone-white patches danced near the fence. Clara planted herbs outside the window, rosemary, mint, sage. She didn't need to speak to know their names. She knew them by scent, by touch, by memory passed down from a mother, who used to crush leaves between her palms and rub them behind Clara's ears. One afternoon, Clara found a folded paper tucked between the pages of an old book Clayton had given her. It was torn, yellowed, ink smudged, lettered it. It wasn't meant for her. I forgive you, Josiah, for the barn, for not being there, for what you did with your silence. But I won't forget. And I won't come down off this ridge until I learn how to breathe without that scream in my ears. Clayton's real name was Josiah Clayton, and there was someone he once couldn't forgive. Himself. Clara folded the letter slowly and tucked it back where it came from. She didn't ask. She didn't run. Instead, the next morning, she placed a single pine carving on his plate before breakfast. A woman holding a baby. The woman's eyes were closed, but her arms were strong. The baby was carved with such gentle detail that Clayton held it in his calloused palms for many minutes without speaking. That was how they healed, not with words, with moments. Later that season, a boy came to the ridge. His name was Ellis. Maybe 10, maybe 11, skinny as a fence post, and just as lost. He had a wound on his leg and 2 bruises on his cheek. Said nothing of his family, only that he'd walked for 2 days, hiding in thickets, drinking from creeks, eating from other people's baskets. Clayton wanted to send him to the sheriff. That's what men did in these cases. That's what the world demanded. But Clara touched the boy's forehead, cleaned his wound, and made soup so they let him stay. Ellis didn't speak much, but his eyes held the kind of fear that lives deep. And he flinched at the sound of boots. He ate too fast, like every meal might be his last. He kept a knife under his pillow. When Clara found it, she didn't take it away. She only brought him a second once, smaller, sharper, the leather sheath. He cried the night she gave it to him. 1 month turned into 3, by the time summer bled gold into the valley. Ellis was riding the mule down into town, trading eggs for flour. He still didn't talk much, but he followed Clara everywhere like a shadow stitched to her skirt. Sometimes he helped Clayton carve badly at first, then better. He built a birdhouse with crooked sides and painted it orange. It hung outside the kitchen window and made Clara laugh, soundless but real. That autumn, the sheriff came. He rode up slow, dust trailing behind him like an accusation. He asked after the boy, said there was trouble back east. A dead man, a runaway child. No charges, not yet. Just questions. Ellis stood behind Clara's skirt and wouldn't come out. Clayton didn't lie. He never had, he told the sheriff the boy. Came hungry, came limping, came with no threat in him. But the law didn't listen to silence. It only listened to signatures. Clara took the sheriff's hand, pressed a letter into it. It wasn't signed, but it told the story of a woman once, sold like cattle, who found shelter on a ridge, and a man who gave nothing but space and fire and safety. It told of a boy who came with a wound and a look in his eyes like she'd once seen in her own. It told of second chances carved in pine and letters left in windows and quilts mended by hands that remembered pain. The sheriff read it. He didn't speak for a while. Then he nodded, said something about paperwork being slow in the mountains, and rode away. They never heard from him again. That winter, Ellis called Clara Ma once by accident. She froze. He froze. And then he said it again, this time with purpose. Clayton watched from the porch, one hand on his cane, and whispered the word family like it was a prayer he hadn't dared try before. Clara smiled. She never said it back. But the next carving she left on the windowsill was of 3 figures, 2 tall, 1 small, all standing in snow, heads tilted toward the sky. The ridge had long since accepted them. Wind no longer howled with warning. It hummed, like it was learning their names. The trees bent less in protest and more in greeting. Even the snow, when it came that 3rd winter, came gently like a memory. Instead of a burden, inside the wooden house, warmth had found roots. Clara still did not speak, and no one asked her to. She tended to things in a way only someone who had once been unwanted could, carefully, patiently, without waste. She mended everything, even what others would throw away. Cracked mug, a torn shirt, the frayed hem of Ellis's coat. She treated objects like lives, Clayton often said she was the only person he'd ever known who could bring a room back from the dead without making a sound. Ellis had grown. It's both taller and quieter. But his silence no longer came from fear. It came from the comfort of not needing to perform. He began to hum while working, whistled for the mule. Sometimes he even told stories short, strange ones about what the birds might be thinking, or how clouds were just sky ghosts taking their time to move on. He had light in his eyes now, and trust in his hands. He was 11 when the telegram came. Clayton had gone into town that day. When he returned, his eyes were darker, and he did not take off his coat. He handed Clara the paper and stepped back like it might strike her instead of him. The paper was simple. Jacob Holloway, released. Will collect the boy. Sunday. She stared at it for a long time, and slowly folded it and slid it beneath the kettle, where the heat wouldn't reach it, and the flame wouldn't dare touch it. Jacob Holloway, Ellis's father. Clayton didn't say anything. Neither did Clara. But the quiet between them that evening was not peace. It was the kind that waits at the edge of something breaking. When Ellis came in from feeding the hens, his boots muddy and his cheeks flushed, he looked at their faces and knew. He didn't cry, didn't panic. He just walked out to the porch and sat under the lantern. Arms wrapped around his knees, staring out into the dusk. Clara joined him not long after. She didn't bring a blanket, didn't bring tea, just herself. She sat beside him and placed her hand over his. He didn't look up when he asked, "Do I have to go?" She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She just held his hand tighter. Clayton spent the night carving. By morning, a small wooden box sat on the boy's pillow. Inside was a carving of 3 people standing in a circle, arms not touching but clearly belonging to one another. Underneath was a message carved in small letters. Blood builds the body, but love builds the soul. On Sunday, the man came. Jacob Holloway was not what they expected. He looked tired, thin, older than his years, the kind of man who had once believed in something and paid for it dearly. His voice was hoarse. His boots were too new. His hat too clean for someone who claimed to want his boy back. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. Stood at the edge of the porch and said, "I come to take what's mine." Ellis stood behind the door, peeking out. Clara opened it and stepped forward. Her shoulders were still small, but her presence had grown solid. Rooted, she handed Holloway a letter. He read it in silence, his jaw clenched halfway through. But by the end, his face had soft and creased, not by anger, but something heavier. Regret. Clayton joined them a few moments later. No gun, no cane. Just eyes that looked like they'd once walked through fire and lived long enough to know that. Not every battle ends in noise. You ever raise a boy? Clayton asked him. I had one. No, Clayton said quietly. You had a child. We raised the boy. Holloway looked down at his boots. He's mine. Clayton didn't argue. Instead, he looked toward the door where Ellis now stood, not hiding, then asked him. The man turned to the boy. Ellis, he said gently, you remember me? The boy nodded once. You're my son, Holloway said. I was wrong back then. I was angry. I hurt people. I was punished. I want to try again. A job now. A little place outside of Junction. It's not much, but it's something. I want you there. Ellis looked between the 2 men, then to Clara, then to the mountains behind them, and he said, For the first time in front of everyone, I'm already home. His voice cracked, but it held. Holloway didn't answer. He only nodded then. Won't take you, he whispered, but I'll leave you something. From his coat, out a photograph worn and faded. It was a picture of Ellis's mother, young, bright, holding a baby in her arms. You ought to know where you come from, he said, and handed it to the boy. Then he turned and left. No anger, no fight. Just the quiet footsteps of a man who had learned something too late, but learned it still. Later that spring, Clara found something strange in the garden. A second letter, folded inside a leather pouch, tucked under the corner of the herb bed. It was from Holloway. I couldn't raise him, But I see now that doesn't mean he didn't get raised right. Thank you. You've done more than I deserved. If you ever need anything, ask. I'll come. It was signed only with an X that summer. Ellis carved his first real piece. It was a woman standing beside a boy. No mouths on either of them. Just eyes, strong and full. The plaque underneath said, "She never needed words. She made me whole." All. Years passed. Ellis became a man. He stayed. Built another room on the house. Brought home a girl with wild hair. And eyes that didn't blink in stormlight. They married under the lone pine tree near the ridge's edge. Clayton stood as witness. Clara held the rings. On the night of their wedding, as the fire crackled and laughter echoed softly, Ellis pulled Clara aside. "I never told you something," he said. She looked up. "The night you gave me the second knife, I was gonna run. I was gonna leave before anyone else could hurt me." Her expression didn't change. "But then you gave it to me like I was worth protecting. Not just worth watching." He touched her hand, gently. "That saved me." She didn't cry. She only smiled. And later that night, while everyone else slept, she walked alone to the edge of the ridge and stood beneath the moonlight. She held something. In her hand a letter, old, torn, smudged. Clayton's, the one he'd written to his brother, all those years ago. She didn't burn it. She buried it deep in the soil beside the herbs she still tended. And with that, the last ghost of the past was given to the ground. The ridge house stood taller. Now its windows glowed longer in the evenings, and in the town far below, people still whispered about the silent woman who'd been auctioned once, long ago, about the man who bought her without a word, about the boy who called her mother though she never spoke his name. Some said it was a strange tale, others called it a miracle, but those who truly knew said only this: sometimes the loudest love is the kind that never makes a sound. When snow came again that year, it came soft like it remembered them, and stayed forever.